Under the crimson wash of dawn, the desert stretched silent and endless, broken only by the wind that moved through the dry mesquite and the lonely cry of a hawk circling above the ridge. Thomas Hargrove stood at the edge of a small mound of freshly turned earth, his hat pressed tight against his chest, his boots sunken in the red dust. The cross he'd built from 2 rough planks leaned slightly forward, the name Mary Hargrove carved by a trembling hand. There were no flowers. Nothing grew here. Only a single stone he had chosen from the riverbank rested at the head of the grave, smooth and pale, like the skin of the woman he had loved. He didn't cry anymore. The tears had run dry 2 nights ago when she slipped away, her fingers cold in his grasp, her last breath a whisper he could barely hear. Now only the baby's cries filled what was left of his world. That small, fragile sound carried through the still air and cut deeper than any wound he had known. It was the sound of life clinging to the edge of death. He looked up, the sun creeping over the hills, painting everything blood-red. His throat was dry, his eyes hollow. The war had taken pieces of him before, but this was something worse. Grief had a weight heavier than a rifle, heavier than guilt. He could almost hear Mary's voice in the wind, soft and kind, asking him to be strong, asking him to save their child. But all he could think was how he had failed her. He had failed to bring a doctor in time, failed to keep her alive, and now he was failing again. He turned toward the cabin. The sound grew louder, the tiny, choking sobs of his daughter. Inside, the air was still thick, with the scent of birth and death mixed together. The sheets were stained, the floor scattered with cloth and old bandages. The cradle, a rough thing he had built months ago, rocked weakly from her movement. The baby's face was red, her lips cracked from crying, her tiny fist trembling in the air. "Shh," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking as he knelt beside her. "I know, sweetheart, I know." He lifted her into his arms, cradling her close to his chest, and the small body shuddered against him. She was so light, it frightened him. He had fought men, faced death, seen blood spill across the sand, but nothing in his life had terrified him like this little girl gasping for air in his arms. He had tried everything: boiled water mixed with ground oats, soft cornmeal strained through cloth, but nothing worked. She wouldn't take it. She needed milk, real milk, and there was none for miles. His horse was thin, his supplies almost gone. He had gone to town the day before, desperate. He had ridden through the dust and into the main street of Silver Creek, with the child wrapped against his chest, her weak cry barely heard over the wind. He had knocked on every door he could think of, begged at every porch. But when the women saw his face, they turned away. The men watched from behind half-closed doors, spitting into the dirt. They remembered his name, the old stories. The soldier who once fired on Apache warriors in the war. The man whose land now bordered the territory of the very people he'd fought. He remembered one woman's words, sharp as a blade. "You think any decent mother here would give her breast to a murderer's child?" Then the door slammed, and he was left standing in the dust with his baby wailing against his chest. He rode home under a sky of dying light, the child's cries fading to whimpers. When he reached the cabin, he placed her back in the cradle and sat beside it, his head bowed, his heart a stone in his chest. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten. He didn't care. His hands trembled as he dipped a cloth in warm water and touched it to the baby's lips. She turned her head weakly away. Her breathing was shallow now, and each sound felt like another clock tick counting down. "I don't know what to do, Mary," he whispered into the stillness. "I don't know how to save her." The lamp on the table flickered, throwing his shadow against the wall. He bowed his head, his fingers clasped together, but he couldn't bring himself to pray, not properly. The words felt empty now. He had prayed when Mary screamed in the night, when the blood wouldn't stop, when the midwife didn't come. No one had listened then. Why would they now? But something deep inside him, something beyond logic, whispered that he had to try one more time. "Lord," he muttered, his voice shaking, "if you're still out there, if you've got anything left for a man like me, don't take her too." The only answer was the wind pressing against the windows. Hours passed. The baby fell into a fitful sleep, her breathing shallow but steady. Thomas sat slumped beside the cradle, his hat resting on his knees. The night crept in quiet and cold, stars spilling across the desert sky. The fire burned low and the shadows lengthened. Every few minutes he checked her chest, terrified of stillness. He could hear coyotes howling in the distance, their voices mournful and hollow. Each cry felt like a reminder of how small and alone they were out here. His eyes burned from sleeplessness, but his mind wouldn't rest. He kept thinking of the hills beyond his land, where the horizon glowed faintly with scattered fires, the Apache camp. He'd seen the smoke before, always from a distance. He'd been told not to go there, that they'd kill any white man who crossed their path. But now, as he stared out the window, watching the faint orange flicker far off in the dark, he felt something stir inside him. Not courage exactly, something deeper, desperation strong enough to burn through fear. He stood, his body heavy with exhaustion, and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a slap. The desert stretched endless before him, silent except for the wind rustling the grass and the soft creak of the barn. He looked toward the hills again. The glow was clearer now, small fires shimmering against the dark ridge. He thought of the stories, the Apache women, the way mothers nursed their children even in hunger. He remembered, too, the faces of the ones he'd seen long ago during the war, mothers carrying infants on their backs as soldiers marched past. Back then, he hadn't looked at them as people, just shadows. Now he saw them differently. Now he saw what he had never seen before, that they were human, that they had hearts, that one of them, just one, might have mercy. He turned back to the cabin, his eyes falling on the small form sleeping in the cradle. The baby stirred, her lips trembling. He knelt beside her again and touched her cheek with a rough hand. Her skin was warm but fragile, her heartbeat faint against his fingers. "Hold on, little one," he murmured, voice thick with tears he refused to shed. "Just one more night. I'll find you what you need." He reached down, picked up his hat, and set it back on his head. The decision was made. At dawn, he would ride to the ridge. If they killed him, so be it. If they spared him, maybe his daughter would live. The wind picked up, whispering through the dry grass like a warning. Thomas didn't flinch. He'd faced death before, but never for something that mattered this much. He sat again in the chair beside the cradle, exhaustion pulling at him. His eyelids grew heavy, and his head dipped forward. The fire burned low, filling the room with a faint golden glow. Outside, the coyotes had gone quiet, and the world seemed to hold its breath. In his dreams, he saw Mary's face, smiling, gentle, and behind her, the same faint orange glow in the distance. When he woke, the first light of morning had touched the sky. The baby whimpered softly, weak but alive. Thomas stood, his joints stiff, and stepped out into the cold dawn. He looked once more toward the ridge where the Apache fires had burned through the night. The smoke was still there, curling into the pale horizon like a promise. He took a deep breath, tasting dust and resolve. "All right," he whispered to himself, tightening his coat around his shoulders. "If you won't come to me, then I'll come to you." He turned back to the cabin, to the cradle, to the child who had given his broken life meaning again. He brushed a finger gently across her tiny forehead, then whispered words meant for her mother, for the heavens, for anyone who might be listening. "I'll bring her back safe, Mary. I swear it." The baby stirred, a small sigh escaping her lips. Thomas felt something steady in his chest for the first time in days, a fragile spark of hope. Outside, the desert waited, painted gold by the rising sun. The hills loomed far and silent, holding both danger and salvation. He looked toward them one last time before stepping back inside. Tomorrow he would ride. Tomorrow he would face whatever waited beyond those red hills, even if it meant never coming back. The dawn came cold and hollow. Pale light crept through the cracks of the cabin, sliding over the rough floorboards, touching the cradle where the baby slept in uneasy quiet. Thomas Hargrove stood by the doorway with his rifle slung across his shoulder, his hat pulled low against the wind that rolled off the desert. The air smelled of dust and distance, the kind that told him he might not come back. He'd left a small jar of water by the cradle and wrapped the baby in his wife's shawl. Every sound the child made turned him back toward the house, heart tightening like a rope. But he couldn't stay. There was nothing left here that could save her, only what waited beyond those red hills. He saddled the horse in silence. The animal snorted, stamping the ground as if it too knew where they were headed. When Thomas climbed on, the first warmth of the sun spilled across the plain, painting everything in gold and shadow. He gave one last look at the cabin, his home, his failure, and maybe, if God was kind, the place he'd return to. Then he nudged the horse forward. The desert spread before him like an ocean of rust and stone. Hours passed beneath a sky so wide it made a man feel smaller than dust. He rode through heat that shimmered against the horizon, the only sound the creak of saddle leather and the faint cry of hawks circling high above. He followed the ridgeline, guided by the faint column of smoke he'd seen the night before. Each mile brought him closer to the land that townsfolk called cursed. He'd heard stories in saloons about Apache warriors who could vanish into the rocks, about arrows that found their mark before a man even heard the wind shift. Thomas didn't care anymore. Fear had burned itself out of him the day Mary died. By mid-morning the hills rose up sharp and red against the sky. He dismounted, leading the horse as the trail narrowed to a thin cut between boulders. The silence here was different, deeper, watchful. He could feel eyes on him, though he saw nothing. Then a sound came, a soft scrape of movement behind the stones. Thomas stopped, one hand on his rifle. A voice rang out, short and sharp, echoing across the rock. Another answered it. Shadows shifted. "Easy," he muttered to his horse, though it was himself he was trying to calm. He lifted one hand slowly, palm open, and called into the air. "I come in peace. I mean no harm." No answer. The wind carried only the faint buzz of flies and the far-off whisper of sand. Then they appeared. Two Apache men, young and lean, their bows drawn, eyes hard and wary. Beads hung from their hair, feathers catching the light. One spoke in his own tongue, his voice low but edged. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he caught their meaning well enough. "Turn back." "I can't," he said quietly. "My baby, she's dying. I just need help. Milk. Please." The men didn't lower their weapons. One of them stepped closer, gaze flicking to the rifle slung on Thomas's shoulder. Thomas unbuckled it and laid it carefully on the ground. The men exchanged a few fast words. Then one vanished behind the rocks, light as smoke. Minutes stretched. The sun climbed higher, burning the top of his neck. He could feel sweat trickling down his spine, could hear his own heart like hoofbeats in his chest. The remaining guards stood stone still, watching him without blinking. Then she came. At first, Thomas thought the heat had conjured her, a mirage of calm against the fierce light. She was slender, her skin sun-warmed bronze, her long black hair braided and tied with small turquoise beads that caught the sun. She wore a simple buckskin dress, worn but clean, and in her eyes there was a quiet that unsettled him more than all the drawn bows in the world. The young man beside her said something quickly. She replied in Apache, her tone firm, then stepped forward. Thomas could see the fine lines of grief on her face, like cracks in a sculpture. She stopped a few paces away, studying him. "You come alone," she said in hesitant English. He nodded, his throat dry. "Yes, ma'am, alone." Her eyes moved to the rifle on the ground, then back to him. "Why?" Thomas swallowed hard. "My wife. She died giving birth. The baby's hungry. She needs milk. Please." "I'll pay, or—" His voice broke. "I'll do anything you ask." Something flickered in her eyes. Pain, then something softer. She said a few words to the man beside her, and he lowered his bow, though his posture stayed rigid. "My name is Thomas Hargrove," he said quietly. "I don't mean trouble. I am Nayeli." The name fell gently, like water on stone. She looked past him, toward the open land he'd crossed. "White men do not come here." "I'm not most white men," he said, the words raw. I just want my daughter to live." She stood silent a long moment, the wind tugging lightly at her braid. Then she turned her head slightly and spoke to the man again. He protested, his voice low but fierce. She answered once, firmly, and he fell quiet. Finally, she looked back at Thomas. "I help," she said. For the first time in days, something like hope flickered in him. She motioned for him to follow. They walked through a narrow pass where red rocks rose high on either side, the air cooler in the shadows. Thomas led his horse, careful not to make sudden moves. He could feel unseen eyes watching, children peering from behind huts, old women standing silent, a few warriors standing at a distance with guarded expressions. The camp was small but alive, smoke curling from cook fires, the scent of corn and herbs drifting in the air. Nayeli guided him toward a low hut of woven branches and hides. Inside it was dim and smelled faintly of sage and smoke. She gestured for him to wait, then disappeared behind a curtain of deerskin. Thomas stood awkwardly, hat in hand, unsure if he should sit or breathe too loudly. When she returned, she carried a small clay bowl. She dipped a cloth into it and held it out. "For baby," he hesitated. "You mean?" She nodded once. "She lost her own," said the voice of an older woman who had appeared behind her, speaking in accented English. "Her milk is still strong. The spirits send her this child." Thomas looked from the woman to Nayeli, unsure how to speak. His eyes burned suddenly, and all he could manage was a hoarse, "Thank you." Nayeli's gaze softened. "We go," she said simply. They left the camp before noon. The two young warriors watched them until the desert swallowed the trail. Thomas rode slowly beside her, glancing sometimes at the small pouch she carried with the bowl wrapped inside. She didn't talk much. When she did, her words were measured, like each had weight. He tried to thank her again, but she only said, "We do what must be done." The sun hung high when they reached the ridge overlooking his land. From up there, the cabin looked like a forgotten speck, its roof half collapsed, the small barn beside it leaning against the wind. Nayeli stared a long time at the emptiness of it. "You live here, alone?" He nodded. "It was different once, before she died." She said nothing more, but her eyes carried understanding too deep for words. When they reached the cabin, the air inside was stale and heavy. The baby's cry was weak now, more whimper than sound. Nayeli moved quickly, laying aside her pouch and reaching for the child with gentle hands. Thomas froze, afraid she'd think the place too poor, too broken, but she didn't flinch. She lifted the baby, pressing her close, and whispered something in Apache, soft, melodic, like a lullaby without rhythm. The baby quieted, as if she knew the voice. Thomas stood motionless, watching. Nayeli's expression shifted, her eyes glistening. Grief and tenderness mingled in her face like sunlight through smoke. Minutes passed. The sound of the baby nursing filled the small room, slow and steady. Thomas felt the tightness in his chest ease for the first time in days. When it was done, Nayeli wiped the baby's mouth and laid her gently in the cradle. "She's strong," she said softly. "She will live." Thomas sank into the chair by the table, the weight of exhaustion finally hitting him. He looked at her, the woman who had crossed the line between fear and mercy, and felt words rise in his throat that he couldn't quite speak. "You saved her," he said finally. Nayeli shook her head. "No, she saved me." He didn't understand then, not fully, but he saw something in her eyes, something hollow and haunted. She stayed that night. When darkness came, Thomas lit the lamp, its golden light trembling against the walls. Outside, the coyotes cried again, and the desert wind slipped through the cracks like a sigh. The baby slept peacefully now, wrapped in Mary's shawl. Nayeli sat near the fire, her gaze lost in the flames. "Your woman? She was good?" "The best there ever was." His voice softened. "She kept this place alive." Even the land seemed to listen to her. Nayeli nodded, her fingers tracing the pattern of beads at her wrist. "I had a child," she said after a pause. "Small boy. Fever came." He went to the spirits. Thomas looked at her, and for a long moment neither spoke. The fire crackled quietly between them, two strangers from two worlds bound by the same wound. He rose and poured her a cup of water. She accepted it with a small nod. Their hands brushed briefly, and both drew back, startled by the contact. Something fragile hung in the air, a thread that neither dared touch. "Thank you," he said again, barely above a whisper. Nayeli looked into his eyes, her own calm but deep. "You fight for life," she said. "That is good." They sat in silence a while longer, listening to the baby's soft breathing. Outside, the moon rose, painting the desert silver. When the lamp burned low, Thomas laid a blanket near the fire for her. "You can rest there," he said quietly. "You're safe here." Nayeli nodded once, then lay down without another word. Thomas stayed awake a while longer, staring at the fire, at the shadow of her form against the wall, at the small miracle sleeping in the cradle. He thought of how strange life could be, that mercy had come not from his own kind, but from the very people he'd once feared. That hope could wear the face of someone the world had told him was an enemy. The fire cracked softly, the wind whispered through the grass, and Thomas closed his eyes. Tomorrow would bring new questions, maybe new dangers, but for the first time in a long while, he let himself believe in something again. In the middle of the night, when the world was quietest, Nayeli stirred. She rose silently, walked to the cradle, and touched the baby's cheek. Her lips moved in a prayer no one but the spirits could hear. Thomas watched from the shadows, unseen. Outside, far across the desert, the fires of her people flickered faintly against the horizon, tiny lights in an endless dark, calling her home. But she did not go. She stayed. The morning light poured through the cracks of the cabin, soft and golden, warming the worn, wooden floorboards. Thomas awoke to the sound of the baby's laughter, small, tender bursts of life that carried through the quiet air like a song. For a moment he thought it was Mary's voice he was hearing, that gentle hum she used to make when she cradled the child she never got to know. But when his eyes opened, he saw Nayeli by the window, her long hair loose, catching the sunlight as she rocked the infant in her arms. The sight stopped him cold. For days now he had lived between death and waking, but here, in this soft glow, the world seemed to breathe again. The baby's cheeks were no longer pale, her tiny hands clutching the folds of Nayeli's dress as she fed. It was the first time Thomas realized just how young Nayeli truly was. Not much more than 20, though her eyes carried the depth of someone who had seen far too much of the world. He sat up slowly, rubbing his neck. "She looks better," he murmured. Nayeli turned her head, a faint smile brushing her lips. "She's strong now, like her mother." Thomas's chest tightened. The word mother struck him deep, but there was no bitterness in Nayeli's tone, only reverence. He nodded. "You've given her more than I ever could." Nayeli glanced down at the child and whispered something in Apache, a short prayer he couldn't understand but felt in the tone. She laid the baby gently back in the cradle, then stood, smoothing her dress. Outside, the desert shimmered under the growing heat. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, the wood creaking under his boots. The horizon was endless, and for once, it didn't feel empty. Nayeli followed, standing beside him, her bare feet silent on the boards. He spoke without looking at her. "Town's a half-day ride south. I can trade for more supplies. Flour, salt, maybe a bit of medicine." Her eyes shifted toward the horizon. "You go alone?" "Best that way," he said softly. "The folks down there, they wouldn't take kindly to seeing you." Her expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened slightly around the fabric of her dress. "I know." White men's eyes cut sharper than knife. Thomas looked at her then, guilt pressing heavy on his chest. "Not all of us," he said. "Not anymore." She gave a small, knowing nod and turned her face to the wind. It'd take time to change hearts. He couldn't argue with that. He watched her for a long moment, her hair lifting in the breeze, her gaze far away. There was something about the quiet strength she carried that unsettled him, not with fear, but with something he hadn't felt since Mary was alive. He left her tending the fire while he rode into town. The road was long, lined with mesquite and dry cactus, the sun beating down like a weight. He arrived in Silver Creek near noon, the town already stirring with heat and gossip. Men leaned on fences. Women shaded their faces under wide hats, and the smell of dust and horse sweat hung thick in the air. When he walked into the general store, silence followed him. "Morning, Hargrove," the storekeeper said, his tone measured. "Heard you've been keeping company out there on your land." Thomas froze, jaw tightening. "What I keep is my own business." The man shrugged, weighing sugar with deliberate slowness. "Ain't my sayin'. Just folks talkin'. Heard tell you've got yourself a squaw livin' under your roof." Thomas's hand clenched on the counter. "She's saving my child's life." "Call it what you like," the man muttered. "But folks don't forget who they lost in those raids. You'd do best not to test their patience." Thomas took his supplies, paid twice the fair price, and left without another word. The stares followed him out the door. As he mounted his horse, he caught sight of the sheriff across the street, a tall man with a gray beard and a badge that glinted like a warning. The sheriff tipped his hat slowly, eyes narrowing. On the ride home, Thomas's anger simmered. The desert swallowed his curses, carrying them off into the hot wind. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun was sinking low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red. Nayeli was outside, hanging wet clothes on a line near the well. She turned when she heard him, and for a moment, the tension in him broke. Her smile was faint but real, and the baby slept peacefully nearby in a basket, the evening light warm on her face. "Town was rough," he said, dismounting. She tilted her head, concern flickering in her eyes. "They speak bad? They always do," he sighed. "But I don't care what they think." Nayeli's hands stilled. "You should care. Their hate not die easy." Thomas stepped closer, his voice low. "I fought enough battles, Nayeli. I'm not fighting this one for them. I'm fighting it for her." He nodded toward the baby. Something softened in Nayeli's face. "Then you have heart of warrior." He gave a small, tired laugh. "That's generous of you to say." That night the air cooled, and the stars came out thick and bright. The two of them sat by the fire, the baby asleep between them. Thomas poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed one to her. She sniffed it, curious, then took a sip and grimaced. "Bitter," she said. He smiled faintly. "That's how it keeps you alive." She looked at him then, truly looked, her eyes deep and searching. "You live in pain long time." He didn't deny it. "I've lost too much. Mary, the ranch, most of who I used to be." She nodded slowly. "Pain make you strong, or make you hollow." He met her gaze. "Which one are you?" For a long moment she said nothing. Then, softly, "Both." The firelight danced across her face, tracing the lines of quiet sorrow there. Thomas found himself studying her. The way her lips moved when she spoke, the curve of her cheek, the faint scar at her temple. He wondered about her child, about the life she'd left behind in the Red Hills. When he spoke again, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "Do you ever think of going back?" She stared into the flames. "No place to go. My people see me with you, they turn away. Say I forget who I am." "You haven't," he said. "Maybe I have," she murmured. "Maybe I am ghost between 2 worlds. Not Apache, not white, just woman who lost everything." The wind slipped through the cracks, stirring the coals. Thomas wanted to say something, anything, but no words seemed enough. Instead, he reached out and placed his rough hand gently over hers. She didn't pull away. Her fingers trembled once, then stilled beneath his touch. They sat like that in silence, the firelight flickering between them, until the lamp burned down and the night wrapped around them both. The days that followed were quieter, softer somehow. Nayeli tended the baby and the small garden behind the cabin, humming songs that Thomas didn't understand but liked to listen to anyway. Sometimes he'd catch her dancing slightly as she worked, her bare feet light on the dusty ground, her laughter unguarded for a fleeting moment. He repaired the roof, rebuilt the corral, worked harder than he had in years, partly to keep his hands busy, partly because when he saw her smile, something in him stirred that had been buried long ago. At night, when the baby slept, they'd sit on the porch, watching the stars. Nayeli told stories of her people, how the wind carried the voices of ancestors, how the coyote's cry was a warning against pride. Thomas listened like a man hearing a hymn. One evening, after a long day of work, rain came, sudden, fierce, and cold. The desert drank it greedily. They rushed inside, soaked through, laughing like children. The baby cried at the thunder, and Nayeli held her close, whispering soft words in her language. Thomas watched them, heart swelling. When the storm passed, they sat by the fire, steam rising from their clothes, the air heavy with warmth, and the scent of rain on dust. Thomas looked at her and said, almost without thinking, "You've changed this place." She glanced up. "How?" "It feels alive again." Her eyes met his, the silence between them stretching. "You think it was dead before?" He nodded once. "So was I." For a moment, the only sound was the baby's soft breathing. Nayeli reached out, brushed a strand of wet hair from his forehead, and whispered, "Then maybe we both come back to life." He caught her hand in his, the touch electric, but he didn't pull her closer. The moment was too fragile to break. Outside, lightning flashed far off beyond the hills, painting the sky silver. The sound of rain dripping from the eaves filled the stillness. That night, Thomas dreamed of Mary, not as she was when she died, pale and weak, but as she had been once, smiling, radiant, holding their child. She looked at him and said softly, "Let her stay." He woke before dawn, heart pounding, unsure if he truly heard her or if it was only the ghost of memory. When the sun rose, he found Nayeli outside, feeding the chickens, her hair catching the early light. She turned when she saw him, her face calm, eyes full of something he couldn't name. He walked to her, stopping a few steps away. "You don't have to go back," he said. She studied him, the morning breeze lifting her braid. "You ask me to stay? I'm asking you to choose," he said softly. "For her, for yourself, for whatever's left of me." The wind carried her silence. Then, with a small, trembling smile, she nodded. "Then I stay." Thomas felt the world shift, not with thunder or flame, but with the quiet certainty of something beginning. He reached for her hand, and she let him. From the doorway, the baby stirred, her small cry breaking the stillness. Nayeli turned, her face radiant with light, and whispered, "She awake." Thomas watched her move toward the cradle, the soft rhythm of her steps, the grace that filled the room. The desert beyond the window stretched wide and wild, but inside the cabin there was warmth and laughter and something he had not dared believe in again, peace. And as he stood there, watching Nayeli lift the child, Thomas knew that somewhere between grief and forgiveness, two broken hearts had begun to beat as one. The summer heat settled thick over Silver Creek, the kind that made the air shimmer above the dirt road and turned tempers sharp as broken glass. For weeks, the town had been whispering about Thomas Hargrove's ranch, about the Apache woman living under his roof, about the baby she nursed as her own. The rumors spread like wildfire through saloons and church pews, twisting truth into something darker. Thomas didn't care much for what people said, but the stares were harder to ignore. When he rode into town for supplies, he could feel the weight of every pair of eyes following him, the murmur of men spitting tobacco and muttering words he'd rather not hear. Still, he rode straight, back stiff, gaze ahead. He told himself it didn't matter, but it did. By the time he reached home, the sky had begun to bleed orange and violet over the red hills. From a distance, he saw smoke rising from the chimney, smelled the faint sweetness of stew simmering inside. The baby's laughter carried faintly through the open window. That sound, that bright, unguarded joy, was what kept him steady. Inside, Nayeli stood by the table, stirring a pot, humming softly under her breath. Her hair was tied back, a few loose strands catching the light of the fire. The baby sat nearby in a wooden cradle Thomas had mended, babbling and tugging at the edge of her blanket. "You're back," Nayeli said, glancing up with a small smile. "Yeah," Thomas said, removing his hat and setting it by the door. "Town's getting meaner." Her expression darkened slightly. "They speak still?" "They don't just speak." "The sheriff stopped me this morning. Said folks are restless. Told me to set things right before somebody else does it for me." She stirred the pot once more, slowly. "What is right to them?" He hesitated. "Sending you away." The silence that followed was long and heavy. The fire popped, the baby cooed softly, and the world seemed to wait. Nayeli turned toward him, her eyes deep and steady. "You want that?" Thomas shook his head, stepping closer. "No, I want you here, both of you." Her lips parted slightly, her breath catching. But before she could speak, a gust of wind swept through the open window, carrying the smell of dry heat and dust. It felt like a warning. That night, after supper, they sat outside on the porch. The moon hung low over the desert, the sky scattered with stars so bright it seemed they could fall and shatter against the earth. The baby slept inside, her soft breathing a rhythm that calmed them both. "Do you think they'll come?" Nayeli asked quietly. Thomas looked toward the horizon. "I don't know, but I won't let them near you." She studied his face, the scars at his temple, the lines etched deep from years of war and loss. "You fight too long, Thomas. Maybe time to let world be cruel alone." He smiled faintly without humor. "I've let the world take enough from me. It's not taking you." She didn't argue, but the sadness in her eyes said she didn't believe peace could last. Days passed, each one quieter than the last. The tension in town grew, the whispers sharper. A few riders passed along the outer fence one afternoon, their laughter loud, cruel. Thomas saw the dust they left behind and knew it was a message. "We're watching." That evening, as the sun fell, Nayeli found him mending the fence with slow, angry hands. "They will hurt you," she said softly, "for helping me." He looked up, sweat and dust streaking his face. "They'll have to get through me first." Her voice trembled slightly. "And if they do?" He paused, then wiped his brow with the back of his arm. "Then I die knowing I did something worth dying for." She turned away, her eyes glistening. "You think I want that?" He dropped the hammer, the sound sharp against the quiet. "You think I want you to leave?" Neither spoke for a long time. The desert wind moved through the grass, whispering around them. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The air felt too still. He sat by the window, rifle across his lap, eyes on the horizon. Around midnight, he saw the first flicker, faint, then brighter, from the ridge near the barn. He was on his feet before the next flash came. Outside, the smell of smoke hit him hard. Flames licked the side of the barn, orange against the black sky. The horses screamed inside, thrashing against the stalls. "Nayeli!" he shouted, running for the door. She appeared, the baby in her arms, eyes wide with terror. "Thomas, stay inside!" he barked, but she was already following him out. The fire roared higher as he tore open the barn doors. Heat slammed into him like a wall. The animals panicked, hooves pounding, nostrils flaring with fear. He rushed inside, coughing, eyes burning from the smoke. With shaking hands, he cut the ropes, slapping the horses to drive them out. One bolted, another stumbled, nearly knocking him down. "Thomas!" Nayeli's voice cut through the noise. She stood near the doorway, shielding the baby with her shawl, her face lit by the fire's glow. "Get back!" he shouted. "Go inside!" But she didn't move. Instead, she ran toward the water trough, grabbed a bucket, and began throwing water at the flames, spreading along the outer wall. The fire answered with a roar, heat surging so strong it felt alive. Sparks rained down around her, catching in her hair. Thomas lunged forward, pulling her away, just as a burning beam crashed down where she'd stood. He covered her with his body, the force knocking them both to the ground. The sound was deafening, crackling wood, shattering boards, the low moan of collapsing timber. The baby's cry pierced through it all, thin and terrified. When he looked up, half the barn was gone, flames twisting against the sky. 3 riders were fleeing across the ridge, their shadows cutting through the smoke. He couldn't see their faces, but he didn't need to. He knew the kind of men who burned what they feared. Nayeli coughed, struggling to breathe. He helped her up, his own lungs raw, his shirt singed. She clutched the baby close, tears streaking through soot on her cheeks. "They will come again," she whispered. "Then we'll be ready," he said hoarsely. The fire burned itself out by dawn, leaving only blackened ruins and the smell of ash thick in the air. Thomas stood among the wreckage, his hands shaking. The horses had survived, but the barn was gone. Everything they'd built these past months felt fragile now, like smoke drifting away on the wind. Nayeli came to stand beside him, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. "You cannot stay," she said quietly. "They hate what they do not understand. They will not stop." Thomas turned to her, eyes hard. "I've run from too many things in my life. I won't run from this." She shook her head. "This, not your war. It is mine." He caught her wrist before she could turn away. "You think that fire was just for you? They'd burn everything I love if they could. They already did once." His voice broke. "Not again." For a long time she didn't speak. Then, slowly, she reached up and touched the side of his face, her hand trembling. "You still think love can save you?" He looked down at her, the sunlight catching in her dark eyes. "No," he said, "but it's the only thing worth dying for." Something in her cracked. Then, the wall she'd built between herself and the world. She stepped closer, her breath catching as his hands rose to her shoulders. The smell of smoke still clung to both of them, sharp and real. "I am not your wife," she whispered, voice trembling. "No," he said softly. "You're the woman who saved my child." Her eyes filled with tears. "And you saved me." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. For a moment, the world went silent. No wind, no birds, only the sound of their breathing. Then her lips met his, hesitant, then sure. It was not the wild kiss of youth, but something deeper, born of pain and gratitude, and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could still belong somewhere. When they pulled apart, she pressed her hand to his chest. "You make my heart remember," she whispered. He covered her hand with his. "Then don't let it forget." The day passed slowly as they worked to clear the debris. Thomas rebuilt the fence while Nayeli tended to the baby, singing softly as she rocked her. The song was old, a melody of her people, a prayer that carried through the still air. Thomas listened while he worked. The sound, easing something in him he hadn't known, was still broken. By dusk, he was exhausted. He found her sitting on the porch steps, the child asleep in her lap, the sky behind her painted in deep red and gold. She looked up when he approached, eyes calm. "They will come again," she said quietly. "I know." "What will you do?" He looked out toward the desert, where the light was fading. "Whatever it takes." The baby stirred, and Nayeli soothed her gently. Thomas sat beside them, his arm brushing hers. The warmth between them felt fragile, like something that could vanish with one wrong word. "Do you regret staying?" he asked. She thought a long time before answering. "No, regret comes when heart never choose." "I choose." He nodded slowly, unable to speak. Night came soft and slow. They lit a single lantern, its glow spilling across the porch. The desert stretched silent around them, the stars cold and bright. In the distance, coyotes howled, not in warning this time, but as if mourning. Thomas stood after a while, checking the rifle leaning against the wall. He looked toward the ridge where the fire had started. He knew this wasn't the end. The men who came once would come again, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. But now, he wasn't alone. When he turned back, Nayeli had laid the baby down and was watching him. There was something unspoken in her eyes. Not fear, not doubt, but a quiet, unyielding strength. "You're not afraid," he said. "I have already lost everything," she replied softly. "Now I only protect what I found." Thomas nodded, his throat tight. He stepped forward, cupping her face in his hands. "Then we protect it together." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of ashes and the faint promise of rain. The night stretched long and sleepless, the memory of fire still burning in their minds. But in the small cabin that had once been a place of mourning, warmth returned, a fragile peace, born not from safety, but from love that refused to surrender. And as the desert moon rose high over the charred remains of the barn, its light silvering the scorched earth, Thomas Hargrove stood at the doorway, with Nayeli beside him, and the baby sleeping soundly inside. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of the dark. The first light of dawn broke over the blackened hills, spreading gold across the land that had nearly burned to ruin. Smoke still clung to the edges of the barn's remains, thin and ghostly, curling up into the quiet sky. Thomas Hargrove stood at the fence, the ashes crunching under his boots, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. His hands were raw, blistered from a night of work and worry. The fire had taken half of what he owned, but it hadn't taken everything. Behind him, through the open cabin door, came the faint sound of laughter, small, bright, and clean. The baby. She was awake, alive, and that was enough. Nayeli stepped out, her hair braided loosely over one shoulder, the child balanced against her hip. She looked tired, her eyes shadowed from sleepless nights, but there was a calm strength in her stillness. She stood beside him, silent for a while, looking out over the smoldering land. "It will grow again," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. Thomas nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Land don't forget fire that easy. Neither do hearts," she answered, and he turned to look at her. She met his gaze without fear. The wind caught the edge of her shawl, lifting it like a banner, and for a moment she seemed like a part of the desert itself, unbroken, rooted deep in the dust and sunlight. He wanted to speak, but words never came easy to him, not for things that mattered. So instead, he took her free hand, rough and work-scarred, and pressed it to his lips. Nayeli didn't move away. That day, they began rebuilding. Thomas sawed wood until his arms trembled, sweat pouring down his back. Nayeli gathered what could be salvaged: tools, broken boards, scraps of cloth. The baby slept in the shade of an old wagon wheel, her soft breaths carrying through the dry air. They worked without much talking, but every glance between them spoke more than words could. By afternoon, the sheriff came riding up the trail. His horse kicked dust in lazy circles as he dismounted. The man's face was carved from stone, his eyes cold beneath the brim of his hat. "Morning, Hargrove," he said. Thomas didn't stop hammering. "Sheriff." The man stepped closer, the sound of his spurs sharp against the dirt. "Heard about what happened. Shame about the barn." "Yeah," Thomas said. "A real shame." The sheriff squinted toward the cabin. Nayeli was inside now, singing softly to the baby. A song in her own language, sweet and haunting. The sheriff's jaw tightened. "You still keeping her here?" Thomas set down the hammer slowly. "I am." "You're making this harder than it has to be," the sheriff said. "People in town are riled up. They think you're siding with her kind. You know what happened last time someone mixed with them. Ended bad for everyone." Thomas turned, his voice low and even. "You got a problem with me. You say it plain." The sheriff shifted his weight. "My problem is that the town's one bad spark away from another fire, and I don't want it starting here. You understand?" Thomas stepped closer, his eyes like steel. "There was already a fire, Sheriff. You didn't stop it then." The man's mouth twitched, but he didn't answer. He spat into the dust, tugged his gloves tight, and swung into the saddle. "You're a stubborn fool, Hargrove," he said. "But I'll tell the boys to stay off your land, for now." He rode off without another word, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Thomas stood there for a long time, staring after him. When he turned, Nayeli was in the doorway, the baby in her arms, her eyes full of quiet fear. "He will come again," she said. "I know. Why you fight?" "Because it's all I know how to do," he said, and his voice cracked. That night, the air cooled, the desert wind carrying the smell of sage and distant rain. The baby slept soundly for the first time in days. Thomas sat outside with Nayeli, the two of them wrapped in the same old blanket, watching the horizon flicker with faraway lightning. "I used to think this land was cursed," he said softly. "Everything I ever tried to build here, it fell apart. I buried my wife out there by the oak tree, thought I'd never feel anything again. Then you came." Nayeli looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket. "You think I save you?" He shook his head. "No, I think you reminded me what being alive feels like." She smiled faintly. "Life is cruel and kind both. My mother used to say the desert gives and takes the same hand." Thomas nodded. "Your mother sounds wise." "She was," Nayeli said. "She taught me how to listen. To people, to wind, to silence." He looked at her then, truly looked, and for the first time since Mary's death, he felt the weight in his chest ease. "What does the silence say now?" She turned her gaze toward the stars, her eyes shimmering with their reflection. "It says stay." He reached out, took her hand, and didn't let go. Days passed into weeks. They rebuilt slowly. The barn first, then the fence. Neighbors didn't come around anymore, and Thomas preferred it that way. The world beyond their small patch of land seemed distant now, as if time itself had decided to leave them be. Nayeli's laughter returned. She would sing to the baby while she worked, soft melodies that drifted out across the fields. Sometimes Thomas would stop what he was doing just to listen. The sound made the wind seem gentler, the sky less wide. One evening he came in from the fields to find her at the table, teaching the child to crawl across the boards. The baby giggled, tiny hands slapping against the wood. Nayeli looked up at him, her smile bright, alive. "She walks soon," she said proudly. "She's got your stubbornness," he teased. "Yours too." He chuckled, sitting beside her. "You think she'll ever understand what it took to get her here?" Nayeli shook her head, eyes soft. "No, and that is good. Children should not carry ghosts." They ate dinner together. Simple food, bread, and beans, but shared with warmth. Afterward, as the baby slept, Thomas took out his guitar, an old relic that had sat silent for years. His fingers stumbled at first, but the melody came back, slow and sweet. Nayeli listened, her head tilted, eyes glistening. "That song," she said quietly, "it sounds like the sky before rain." He smiled. "Mary used to love it." "Then play for her," Nayeli whispered. "And for me." So he played. The night wrapped around them like a soft blanket, and his music filled the air, a song for what was lost and for what had been found again. Later, when the fire burned low, he reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Their eyes met, and the air between them shifted, slow and certain. He leaned in, his lips brushing hers. Tentative, reverent, as if afraid the moment might vanish. Nayeli's breath caught, then deepened, and she kissed him back. When they finally parted, she rested her forehead against his chest. "If world hate us for this," she whispered, "then let it burn again." Thomas wrapped his arms around her. "Let it try." Morning came soft and golden. They woke tangled together in the light, the baby cooing nearby. Thomas rose, kissed Nayeli's forehead, and stepped outside. The air was cool, the earth damp from the night's rain. The desert smelled alive again. For the first time in months, he smiled. He spent the morning mending the last of the fences, humming under his breath. When he turned, he saw Nayeli walking toward him with the child on her hip, her shawl fluttering in the breeze. The sight stopped him. The woman, the baby, the light around them. It was a picture he never thought his life would hold again. "You're smiling," she said teasingly. "Maybe I just remembered what hope looks like." She laughed softly. "Hope look like tired woman and hungry child?" He grinned. "Looks like home," she blushed faintly, glancing away. "Then we make it stronger," and they did. They planted new seeds, repaired the roof, and shared every sunrise as if it were a blessing. Thomas carved a small wooden toy for the baby, a tiny horse that rocked when you pushed it, and Nayeli made her a necklace of blue beads. Their days found rhythm, their hearts found peace. But peace in the west never lasted long. It was near dusk when Thomas heard the horses, 3 of them, coming fast. He straightened, his gut tightening. Nayeli appeared at the door, baby in her arms, eyes wide. "They come," she said. He grabbed his rifle, motioning her inside. "Lock the door. Stay quiet." The riders crested the hill, the same men who had burned the barn, faces hidden beneath wide hats, guns hanging loose at their sides. "Evening, Hargrove," one of them called, his voice slick with cruelty. "Heard you still playin' house with that squaw of yours." Thomas raised the rifle. "You best turn back," the man laughed. "Or what? You gonna shoot us for tellin' the truth?" The others chuckled, spitting into the dirt. One leaned forward on his saddle, eyes glinting. "You think you can change what folks are, Hargrove? You think you can make her one of us?" Thomas's jaw clenched. "She don't need to be one of you." The man's grin faded. "Wrong answer." He reached for his gun, but Thomas was faster. The rifle cracked, echoing through the valley. The man toppled from his horse, hitting the ground hard. The others froze, then turned their mounts and fled, dust rising in their wake. Thomas stood still, the rifle smoking in his hands, his heart pounding like thunder. Nayeli ran to him, the baby crying in her arms. "They will come back," she said breathlessly. "Then we'll be ready," he said. She grabbed his hand, tears shining in her eyes. "You not alone now. We fight together." He looked at her, at the child between them, at the sun setting behind the red hills. "We're not fighting anymore," he said softly. "We're living." The days that followed were quiet again. Too quiet. But beneath that stillness, something had changed. The people of Silver Creek didn't ride past anymore. They didn't whisper when Thomas came to town. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was understanding, but the hate had gone silent. Months later, the hills turned green with new growth. The barn stood strong again, rebuilt by his own hands. The baby took her first steps on the packed dirt outside, stumbling into Nayeli's arms with a squeal of joy. Thomas laughed, the sound echoing across the land. That night, under a blanket of stars, he held Nayeli close. "You ever think we'd make it this far?" he whispered. She smiled against his chest. "Desert is stubborn. So are we." He kissed her hair, breathing in the scent of her. "We built something here, something they can't take." She looked up at him, her eyes full of warmth. "We built home." The wind sighed across the plains, carrying the smell of wildflowers and distant rain. Inside, the baby slept, her small hand curled around the edge of her blanket. The fire crackled softly, painting golden light on the walls. Thomas looked toward the horizon, where the last of the stars began to fade. The land was quiet, whole again. And in that silence, he knew that whatever storms might come, whatever judgment or memory or grief, they would face it together, because love, in its truest form, was not a dream or a promise. It was the simple, stubborn act of staying. In the heart of the untamed frontier, where hate once burned brighter than the sun, love found a way to bloom from ashes. Thomas and Nayeli's story reminds us that even in the harshest land, compassion can root itself deep, and two broken souls can build something the world cannot destroy: a home, a family, and a peace born from courage. Their love was not bound by color, blood, or law, but by the quiet truth that when hearts choose to stay, no force can tear them apart. If you were moved by this story of love, redemption, and courage under the western sky, make sure to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles, where every tale rides the line between hardship and hope. Don't miss the next unforgettable journey through passion, loss, and the wild beauty of the frontier. Saddle up, hit subscribe, and let your heart ride with us into the next story.